What if I told you the very first god to be worshipped by human beings was black? What if I told you the original name of God wasn't Yahweh, wasn't Jehovah, wasn't Allah, but a name so ancient, so sacred that it echoed through the bones of the earth? Before scriptures were written, before prophets were crowned, before thrones of heaven and hell were carved by human fear. Would you believe it? Because buried beneath temples, beneath doctrines, beneath whitewashed images of divinity is a name that once held the entire breadth of creation. It did not need a Bible to exist. It did not need a priest to be called holy. It was spoken by the wind, etched in fire, sung by rivers, and remembered in the rhythm of the drum. But today, you don't know it. You weren't taught it, you weren't supposed to be, because to know that name, to feel it stir in your blood, would wake up something too dangerous, too powerful, too ungovernable for the systems that depend on you staying spiritually amnesiac. This first African god was not a myth. He was memory, he was present, he was the original shape of sacredness, and he did not vanish, he was erased. By conquest, by colonization, by doctrine dressed as salvation, by hands that trembled at the sight of a black god enthroned. This story begins long before Moses walked the desert, long before the burning bush, before even the idea of sin or salvation was born. Back when black people didn't pray to gods, they prayed as gods, because they carried the divine in their bodies, in their breath, in their skin. They did not fear the heavens, they remembered them. They didn't ask for forgiveness. They spoke in the voice of creation itself. There was no separation between man and God. There was only resonance. And the first African god wasn't just male or female. He was beyond gender, beyond form, beyond division. His name has been lost in translation, mispronounced in scrolls, and fragmented across time. But he once walked with men, not above them, with them, as them, and his temples weren't built from gold. They were the wombs of mothers, the circles of fire, the soil soaked in ancestral footprints. So why was he erased? Why was the memory of the first god buried beneath cathedrals and crosses? Why is it that today we pray with names that colonizers gave us, but we do not even remember? The name we were born speaking in our souls, because this first god wasn't convenient. He didn't require obedience. He awakened sovereignty. He didn't demand worship. He reminded you that you were divine too. And no system built on control can survive. In the presence of a God who tells you you don't need permission to access the sacred. That's why the story of the first African god was dismantled, rebranded, demonized, forgotten, but not forever. Because now, something in you is rising. Some ancient chord is vibrating in your chest. A memory that doesn't come from books, but from your bones. The first African god is not just history. He is your inheritance. And his vanishing is not a myth, it's a wound. And wounds bleed stories. So we begin not with mythology, but with memory, and the deeper we go, the more you'll begin to see that the God you've been taught to kneel before may not be the one who first whispered your name into existence. Before anyone wrote a commandment in stone, before any prophet claimed to speak for the sky, there was a God who walked barefoot through black soil, whose voice moved through thunder, and whose eyes glowed in the night like the stars he created. He needed no book to prove his power, no church to validate his name. He simply was. And the people knew it. They called him by names lost in time. Names sung around fires, painted in ochre, whispered between breath and drumbeat. Names the world no longer speaks, because to speak them now would unravel the very structure of modern theology. He didn't sit on a throne, he was the throne. The land, the sky, the water, the breath inside your mother's lungs. As she labored you into this world, he was not above, he was within. And when the first people looked at the world, they didn't see a God out there. They saw themselves reflected, glorified, sacred, because this first African God wasn't just a being, he was a mirror. And when you looked into his face, you saw your own and you remembered. But memory is dangerous to empires, so they began the erasure. Not with violence first, but with story. They rewrote the divine in their own image. They painted God pale, draped him in foreign robes, gave him a language the ancestors never spoke. They turned your God into a stranger, and then told you to worship him. Do you see the crime? They took the God who walked among black bodies, the God who danced, who bled, who breathed with his people, and turned him into a silent, judging, Eurocentric deity. Watching from above, disconnected, cold, they said your God was dead, primitive, pagan. They said your rituals were curses, your drums, devil's music, your ceremonies, witchcraft, your symbols, dangerous. And so, generation by generation, you were taught to fear what your ancestors once held as sacred. You stopped dancing, you stopped chanting, you stopped dreaming. And slowly the God who once lived in your breath became a ghost story, a superstition, and a forbidden memory, but he never left. He only went silent, waiting for someone brave enough to listen beyond the noise, someone like you, because the first African God did not vanish. He was pushed beneath layers of doctrine, buried under sermons that taught you to hate your reflection, erased by the same system that enslaved your body and colonized your soul, and yet the pulse remains. The whispers haven't stopped. The land still sings his name, if you know how to hear it, and that's why you're here. Not to learn something new, but to remember something old. Something that was always yours. Something that calls to your spirit. Not in English, not in Latin, but in the unspoken rhythm of your own heartbeat. The first African God is waking, and as he rises, so will the truth about who you are, where you come from, and what they tried to make you forget. Before Genesis whispered, "Let there be light," there were black gods who were the light, radiant, ancient, and sovereign. They didn't borrow divinity, they defined it. Their names weren't found in scriptures, and they were carved into mountains, etched into bones, sung through the womb of time. These gods had power not because someone claimed they were holy, but because everything that existed came from their hands and their mouths, their breath. The first African God was not a metaphor. He was the architect of frequency, the weaver of atoms, and he could bend time into spiral, and from his word, galaxies bloomed. We've been told that history began in a garden, but long before Eden, there were jungles, savannas, mountains, alive with the footsteps of black gods who breathed spirit into earth. and taught humans how to walk with stars beneath their feet. Do you know what it means to come from a people who didn't just believe in gods, but gave birth to them? It means the divine was never far. It was in your breath, in your skin, in the smell of rain, in the eyes of your grandmother, as she ground herbs into healing and hummed songs no one wrote down, songs she remembered from before memory. These gods had names you've never been allowed to speak. Names like Ra, Ta, Ma'at, Amun, Asar, names they renamed and demonized, so you'd forget the royalty that birthed your soul. They told you God was angry, but these gods were wise. They taught in symbols, not in punishment. They didn't need sin to make you behave, and they gave you the stars and let you find your own way home. But here's the truth. When these black gods ruled the earth, there were no chains, no guilt, no shame for your skin, your body, your joy. They taught that the divine lived in harmony, not hierarchy. They didn't demand temples. The body was the altar, the sky was the cathedral, the river was the baptism. And then came the invasion. Foreign swords, foreign scrolls, foreign gods, who didn't look like you, who spoke in tongues you never heard, who needed you to kneel so they could rise. And little by little, the names were silenced. The gods were called demons, their temples burned, their followers hunted, their memories edited out of time. But a name is not so easily killed. A name like Amun still echoes. A name like Asar still vibrates. Even if you don't remember it, your bones do. Your dreams do. That's why you're still searching. Because part of you knows what they erased is still buried in the temple of your soul, and it waits for you to return, to reclaim, to say the names again, out loud, with reverence, with defiance, with love. Because the first African god was not forgotten by accident. He was buried on purpose, which means your remembering is a form of resurrection. What happens to a people when the face of their god is stolen, when the divine they once reflected is replaced with a stranger, pale, blue-eyed, cold as marble, distant as empire? What happens when you grow up, bowing to an image that looks nothing like your mother, your grandfather, your tribe? You forget that you were once a mirror of the divine, and you forget that the first god had skin like obsidian, woolly hair like yours, and eyes deep enough to hold the entire cosmos. The first African god was not invisible. He had a face that looked like you. He walked the land in flesh and energy. He lived in the rhythms of drum beats and the curves of rivers. He spoke in winds, but he also smiled through faces, your faces. But when conquest came, they did more than steal your gold. They stole your god and painted him white. They said divinity must look like them, and you must become less. To be worthy of salvation, this was not theology. It was colonization wrapped in scripture. It was psychological warfare disguised as gospel. Because when you change the image of God, you change the image of self. And when a people forget that they were once sacred, they become easy to control. Suddenly, to be holy, you must deny your hair, your songs, your language. To be spiritual, you must forget the gods who spoke your name before you were born. They told you your skin was cursed, that your ancestors were pagans, that your traditions were demonic, and you believed them because they stood in pulpits. with Bibles in hand and power behind their words. But look closer. How is it that every prophet became pale, every angel became blonde, every scripture translated by the hands of conquerors? You don't think they edited the story? You don't think they adjusted the light until your gods disappeared? They needed you to believe that holiness was foreign, that the only way to reach the divine was through their names, their rituals, their approval. But the first African god never asked for your submission. He asked for your alignment. He didn't demand you erase your roots. He was your roots. And even now, through all the layers of distortion, if you sit still, if you breathe deep, if you close your eyes and ask, you will feel him. He never left. He was never defeated. He was just hidden behind whitewashed ceilings and stained glass stories. And now you're starting to see through them, because when you reclaim the face of God, you reclaim your own. And suddenly, you are no longer lost. You are divine again, remembered, awake. And the world that feared your reflection, that world starts to tremble, because they know a people who see God in their own skin can never be enslaved again. The first African god didn't rule from above. He walked beside his people, not as a judge, but as kin. Not as a king demanding fear, but as a force pulsing through earth, body, and sky. He was there when crops were planted, when children were born, when drums were struck under moonlight. He didn't need a temple. His altar was the land. His cathedral was the forest. His worship was breath, dance, fire, and song. He didn't hide behind commandments. He taught through presence, through nature, through rhythm, through the silent knowing past, from elder to child, from dream to dawn. He was not feared, he was felt. But that intimacy, that dangerous closeness between God and man, was too radical for empire, too powerful for priests, too sacred to be sold. So they did what colonizers always do. They removed him from the earth and locked him in the sky. They made him distant, untouchable, unknowable without them. They said you needed a middleman, a preacher, a pastor, a book, to hear the voice that once rose up from your own soul. They replaced the God who sat at your fire with a God who sat on a throne, watching you, judging you with eyes colder than stone. Do you see the switch? From within to without, from intimate to imposed, from embodied to abstract. And then they said, obey this God. Fear him, confess to him. He is not like you. He is above you. He is separate from you. And millions bowed their heads, forgetting that their ancestors once stood upright in the presence of divinity, unashamed, because they were made of the same dust, the same stars, the same breath. You were taught that God watches you. But the first African god walked with you. You were taught that God punishes, but the first African god taught through reflection. You were told that God requires sacrifice, but the first African god said, you are already enough. They stole your proximity to the divine, and by doing so, they stole your power, because a God far away keeps you on your knees, but a God within you, that God makes you rise. So now you must ask, why did they fear a God who walked beside his people? Because a people who walk with their God cannot be conquered. They cannot be owned. They cannot be lied to. That's why he had to vanish. Not because he died, but because they couldn't rule. A people who remembered they were sacred and free, but freedom is returning. Through you, through memory, through the fire in your chest that refuses to dim. The God who walked will walk again. And when you rise, he rises too. When you strip a people of their God, you don't start by burning their temples. You start by poisoning their language. You take the name that once made stars tremble, the name that healed the sick, the name that rose like thunder through ancestral songs, and you call it evil. You say it's the devil. You say it's dangerous. You say it must never be spoken again. And so they did. They took the first African god's name, the one whispered by priests in Kemet, sung by midwives in Nubia, etched into the pyramids of Kush, and they wrapped it in fear, not because it was unholy, but because it was too holy for them to control. And when a name carries that much power, the only way to destroy it is to make the people who once loved it turn against it. So they told you, don't say those names, don't light those candles, don't drum those rhythms, don't call on those spirits. It's witchcraft, it's sin, it's hell. But let me ask you this. Why is it that only your gods became demons? Why are the deities of Africa the only ones portrayed as monstrous, dark, unclean? Why do the gods of the colonizers wear halos while yours wear horns? And it's because they knew the truth, and they feared what would happen if you remembered it. Because the first African god's name, whether it was Amun or Ra or Ausar or something even older, something lost in smoke and chant, was not just a name. It was a vibration, a key, a portal to inner sovereignty. Say it and you remember who you are. Say it, you unlock a lineage. They hoped you'd never recover, and so they rewrote the story. Demonized your pantheon, drenched your memory in shame. They made you curse the very power that once blessed you, and now you carry that silence in your blood. Generations of people afraid to dance how their ancestors danced, afraid to speak in tongues that predate every European alphabet, afraid to say the names that made gods out of men. But let me tell you, what was demonized must now be decolonized, and that begins with your voice. The first African god waits behind that silence, not angry, not ashamed, just waiting for someone brave enough to say his name with love again. And when you do, the fear will melt, the shame will dissolve, and the power you thought was lost will return like thunder through your bones. The first African god was not one among many. He was the source, the original spark, the uncarved root from which all sacred names would later branch. He wasn't borrowed. He wasn't modeled after someone else. He was the blueprint, but over time, those who came after, those who saw the power in that source, began to copy. They didn't start with faith. They started with theft. They took pieces of the African god and rewrote them under new names, new faces, new languages. They took the myth of resurrection, the symbol of the sun, the idea of the divine word, the balance of justice, and embedded them into their own scriptures. And then they buried the original. So when you read about a god who dies and returns, remember, Osar did it first. When you hear about a divine mother holding a sacred child, remember, Isis and Horus came long before Mary and Jesus. When you hear, in the beginning was the Word, know that Ta was already creating the cosmos. With sound, breath, and sacred speech, none of this is coincidence. It's rebranding. It's appropriation sanctified by translation. It's a system that took black divinity, repackaged it, and then told the world that Africa was godless. Do you see the deception? They didn't create a new god. They created a hierarchy. And at the top, they placed their version of the divine, their skin, their language, their symbols. They buried yours, not because it wasn't true, but because it was too true, too old, too close to the source, too empowering. Because the first African god did not control. He awakened. And that's what frightened them. Not your god's wrath, but your god's wisdom, their dignity, their demand for harmony over domination. The conqueror's god said, obey. The African god said, remember. The conqueror's god said, you are broken. The African god said, you are whole. The conqueror's god said, fear. The African god said, live. So which one is closer to the source? Which one calls to your soul? When no one's watching, that tug you feel, that ache for something deeper, that's the source still humming in you, still pulsing, still waiting. Because the first African god was not erased. He was imitated, but no copy, no matter how gilded, can hold the fire of the original. And that fire is starting to rise in you again. Feel it, breathe it, let it remind you. You were never meant to bow to the replica. You were meant to remember the source. The first African god did not rule by fear. He ruled by balance, not the balance of power, but the balance of life, of nature, of cosmos, of spirit and matter dancing in perfect rhythm. He didn't demand submission. He taught alignment. He didn't say obey or perish. He said live in truth and harmony or suffer your own disconnection. This god had no interest in punishing you. He was the wind on your face, the heartbeat in your chest, the whisper in the silence. He didn't hover above with threats. He pulsed within as a guide. His law wasn't written on stone tablets. It was embedded in the soil, the stars, the womb, the tides. It was not forced upon you. It was woven into you. This was the god of Mayat, of divine order, of truth as a way of living and not a weapon. But control has no place in balance, and empire does not thrive where people are free to align with truth themselves. So they changed him. They replaced a god of balance with a god of hierarchy, a god of reward and punishment, a god who watched you from a distance, counting your sins like coins, dangling salvation like bait. They made God into a king, with soldiers and laws, a judge in a high court, a ruler with wrath in one hand, and mercy locked behind performance. And they taught you that if you stepped out of line, you would burn. That if you danced to the wrong rhythm, you were cursed. That if you heard voices that didn't come from their holy book, you were possessed. And yet, in the ancient African world, you were taught to listen to those voices, to honor the unseen, to recognize that spirit moves through everything. You were taught that justice wasn't punishment. It was restoration. But now you kneel out of guilt, not love. You pray from fear, not joy. You hide your doubts instead of exploring them as sacred questions. That's not balance. That's control. And control breeds silence. But the old gods are stirring. The first African god, the one who sat with Ma'at, who knew the weight of the heart mattered more than the rules. He's waking in your memory. He's reminding you that you don't need permission to be whole, that you don't need saving. You need alignment. That truth doesn't come with punishment. It comes with power, and that power, it's your birthright. So let go of the fear they planted in your chest and return to the balance that was never supposed to be broken. The first African god didn't belong to kings. He wasn't reserved for priests. He wasn't guarded behind gates of gold. He was with the farmers, with the healers, with the children playing in rivers, with the women pounding yams and humming the universe back into balance. He didn't need a robe to be worshipped. He didn't sit behind velvet curtains. He was present in the market, in the sweat of labor, in the laughter of elders who knew that God wasn't out there. He was right here. This was a God of access, a God whose power flowed to everyone, not just the educated, not just the chosen, not just those who could read a holy book. But power hates to be shared. So they changed the rules and they created a system where only the elite could speak for God. Only the learned could interpret the sacred. Only the clergy could hold the keys to heaven, and they turned spirituality into a hierarchy. And at the top, a God recast in their image, distant, demanding, male, white, and wholly uninterested in the poor unless they tithed. They told you, God speaks through us, only through us. Come to church, confess to us, submit to us. But the first African god never asked for submission. He asked for relationship. He didn't create clergy. He created consciousness, and he walked with the barefoot, dined with the hungry, spoke through dreams, not degrees. You didn't need a sermon to feel him. You only needed to close your eyes and listen to the song in your blood. That's why they had to silence him. Because a God who speaks directly to the people is a threat to any system built on control, a threat to kingdoms, the threat to churches, the threat to anyone profiting from your spiritual dependence. So they removed your access and they told you, you're not worthy to hear from God yourself. You need a mediator, you need us, and you believed it. But deep inside, you've always known it was a lie. You've always felt something stir when you were alone with the wind. You've heard whispers in moments no preacher could explain. You've seen signs, not written in any scripture. That was him, the God who never stopped walking with you, the God of the people, the God who does not require permission to speak, and who is now rising. Not through cathedrals, but through you, through your questions, your memories, your awakening, because this time he does not need a temple to return. He only needs a soul, willing to remember that God never belonged to the few, he belonged to you. When they realized they couldn't kill the first African god, they buried him somewhere far more dangerous. Not in the desert, not in the sea, but inside you. They pressed him deep into your subconscious, under generations of shame, under sermons that taught you not to trust your instincts, beneath rituals you never understood, but were told would save you. They layered over him with guilt, with fear, with rules written in foreign tongues, and so you forgot. But forgetting isn't the same as losing, because something in you still dreams of drums, still feels power in your spine. when your feet touch soil, still remembers a God who didn't require translation, only presence. This wasn't accidental, it was engineered because they knew a God remembered is a people awakened, but a God forgotten. Well, that's how you control a soul. So they hid him behind stained glass, beneath white robes, beneath institutions that trained you to doubt yourself. If they told you, don't trust your intuition, don't ask too many questions, don't listen to your body, and especially, don't look to the past, because the past would expose the truth. The truth that the God you seek is not new. He's ancient, he's familiar, and he's you. And this is why you've felt that ache, that hollow silence inside organized religion. That feeling that something was always missing, even when you followed every rule. That was him, knocking, waiting, stirring beneath centuries of erasure. The first African God does not live in your memory. He lives beneath it, in your gut, in your dreams, in the way you sway to rhythm without knowing why. He speaks through symbols you see but don't understand, through visions you ignore, through instincts you were taught to silence. And now that you're listening, you realize he never needed to be found. He only needed to be remembered. Because the spirit doesn't die. It sleeps, and when it wakes, nothing can stop it, and it is waking in you. So don't be afraid of the images that come, the names that return, the sacred words that rise in your mouth. Even if you don't know their meaning, that's him. That's you. That's divinity resurfacing. And when it fully rises, the chains they placed in your mind will snap like twigs, because no system, no sermon, no colonizer can bury a God forever. The lie was never that he disappeared. The lie was that he was missing, vanished, erased. But what if he never left? What if he's been here the whole time? Not gone, just ignored. Because they didn't need to destroy the first African God. They only needed to make you stop looking. They gave you new names to worship, new faces to fear, new books to swear by, new rituals to repeat without understanding. And then they turned your head away from the Nile, away from the sun, away from the fire in your belly that once told you you are divine. They didn't kill your God. They redirected your eyes, and like a child told not to look behind the curtain, you obeyed. Not because you didn't care, but because you trusted the voice of the teacher, the preacher, the colonizer who said, everything you need is here. Forget there. But there was the source, there was the root, there was your God. And he never moved, you did. You looked up when you used to look within. You looked west when you used to look south. You looked to heaven while forgetting the sacred power of earth. And that forgetfulness became generational. You stopped dancing in trance. You stopped praying in rhythm. You stopped dreaming in symbols. You traded the God who spoke in visions for one who spoke through doctrine. But silence does not mean absence. And now, as your bones ache with questions, as your dreams whisper louder, as your soul starts to rebel against everything you were told to believe, you begin to turn your head back. And there he is, waiting, not as a ghost, not as a myth, but as memory made flesh. He didn't vanish. He was hidden in plain sight, in the symbols you wear without knowing, in the proverbs your grandmother said without books, in the way your body still knows when to move, when to chant, when to be still. He is the rhythm in your breath, the pulse beneath your logic, the presence that never needed proof, only permission. And now that you're looking again, you realize it was never about finding him. It was about remembering how to see, because gods don't vanish. Only our sight does. They needed you to believe he was fiction, a story, a relic of a primitive people who worshipped animals and stars because they didn't know better. That's how they mocked him, by calling him a myth. But he wasn't a myth, he was memory. Memory carried in drums, in carvings, in breath passed down from elder to child, in the way you instinctively close your eyes. When you feel spirit move through the room, they told you he was mythology, while quoting their own origin stories as fact. They stripped your gods of history and clothed their own in sanctity, and you believed them, not because you lacked wisdom, but because you were taught to distrust your own ancestors. They told you your gods had animal heads, and laughed. They didn't tell you what those heads meant. They didn't tell you those forms were symbolic, not savage. They didn't tell you your ancestors encoded entire cosmologies into sacred art, because they understood what modern minds forgot. Truth is not always literal. Spirit speaks in symbol. But once they labeled it myth, you stopped listening, stopped asking, stopped honoring. And that's exactly what they wanted, because if you realized that the stories of Ausar, of Ma'at, of the Netjeru were not childish fables, but encoded science, soul, and spiritual technology, you'd awaken. You'd stop seeing yourself as the descendant of tribes lost in the dark, and start seeing yourself as the inheritor of divine brilliance, hidden in plain sight. You'd stop begging for miracles and start remembering your power. But they needed you small, they needed you blind, they needed you ashamed of your own sacred inheritance. So they laughed at your gods and replaced them with ones who looked nothing like you. But the memory never died. It whispered in the rhythm of your name. It hummed in the ache of your displacement. It called to you in moments of grief and silence. And now it roars, because memory is not passive. It's alive. It waits in the marrow. And when the right vibration comes, it awakens. So if you feel the chills, if your eyes well with tears for no reason, and if your chest burns with recognition, when you hear names like Auset, Heru, Tehuti, that's not nostalgia, that's remembrance. Your god was never a myth. Your god was encoded in your bones, and now those bones are stirring. The symbols of the first African god weren't just art. They were keys, they were maps, they were soundless songs, meant to awaken memory in anyone ready to see beyond the veil. The Ankh was never just a cross. It was the loop of life, the feminine womb joining the masculine pillar. It was balance, it was regeneration, it was power flowing through you, not above you. The eye wasn't just decoration, it was perception. The eye of Heru wasn't superstition, it was the third eye, intuition, inner knowing, spiritual sight. And the scarab, it wasn't about bugs, it was about transformation, about rebirth from decay, about the power to move the sun. Through will, through alignment, through unseen strength, these symbols were meant to guide your awakening, to remind you who you were, long before a book told you who you should be. But once colonizers and invaders saw their power, they did two things. First, they stole them, took the Ankh and bent it into the cross, took the eye and placed it on their pyramids, then told you it was evil. They put your sacred codes in their secret societies and told you it was witchcraft if you tried to reclaim them. Second, they weaponized them against you and they said, "This is a cult, this is dangerous, this is demonic." And so you began to fear your own power. You began to hide from your own memory. You began to cling to holy symbols that had been stripped of your own face. Because here's the truth. They didn't just erase your God. They inverted him, took his tools and twisted them so that when you saw the Ankh, you felt shame. When you heard third eye, you felt fear. When you saw blackness and stars and ancient glyphs, you felt nothing. Because they severed the connection. But symbols never die. They simply wait for someone, with eyes not blinded by doctrine, with a heart not shackled by fear, with a soul ready to feel what the brain cannot explain. And now those symbols are calling. The eye is blinking, the Ankh is pulsing. The scarab is rising from the ashes. You don't need to learn them. You already know them. Because he didn't just leave you his stories, he left you signs. And now that you're starting to see them again, the veil is thinning. The memory is returning. The power is shifting. And the first African god, the one they tried to bury in symbols, is rising. They told you his name was gone, unpronounceable, untraceable, lost to time like dust blown across the Sahara. But the truth is, his name never left. It was just disguised, folded into proverbs, echoed in lullabies, encrypted in chants your ancestors whispered, while planting crops, birthing children, burying the dead. His name lived in the vibration of vowels your grandmother hummed when she didn't know she was praying. Because names, true names, carry frequency. And the first African god was not a god of syllable, but of sound, breath, vibration. The moment they said his name couldn't be spoken, that was the moment they rewrote history. They knew the danger of calling him directly, so they gave you other names. Names that pointed you away. Names with different power. Names that asked for obedience, not remembrance. They renamed your God, so you'd stop recognizing yourself in them. And yet, his name persists. Not just in the temples of Kemet, not just on the papyrus scrolls, but in the mouths of people who never stopped speaking rhythm, the griots, the shamans, the dreamers who spoke in tones no colonizer could translate. They told you his name was pagan, but what is pagan except a word that means not owned by the church? They said his name was erased, but it's in your skin, in the way you pronounce certain words with your chest, in the way your laughter rises, like a song older than memory. You don't need archaeology to find him, you just need to listen, because when you speak with reverence, with rhythm, with truth, he answers. He doesn't need you to say his name perfectly. He needs you to feel it, to call with your soul, not just your tongue. And when you do, the air changes, the ancestors lean in. Your spine remembers something and no book ever taught. Because names are not for control, they're for connection. And when you connect, when you speak from that place inside you, that was never colonized, you will feel him answer. Not from above, not from a throne, but from within, because the name you're searching for is also the name you forgot you carried. They didn't just erase a god, they rewrote the script, flipped the sacred pages, and scribbled their names over every ancient truth your ancestors once lived by. They made your god a myth, then made their god a master, then told you to kneel. They didn't burn every scroll, just the ones that said you were divine. They didn't silence every chant, just the ones that made you remember. You didn't need permission to be powerful. They erased the temples that aligned with the stars, the stories that honored the feminine as equal to the masculine, the rituals that reminded you. Spirit is a circle, not a hierarchy, because their god required loyalty, obedience, sacrifice. But yours required only truth, present, alignment with nature, with cosmos, with self. So they had to replace him, had to demonize him, had to twist your stories into something they could control. They made the serpent evil when it once symbolized rebirth. They made the woman sinful when she once stood as the throne of the divine. They made death a punishment when your ancestors once saw it as sacred transition. They rewrote everything. And then they told you, this is the only truth. But truth doesn't erase others. Truth doesn't conquer. Truth remembers. And that's what's happening now. You're remembering, you're realizing the God they taught you to fear was once the God your ancestors trusted. The God they outlawed was the one who walked with you, not above you. The God they told you to forget was the one who never needed to be found, because he was never lost, just buried under their story. And what a story! A story that made suffering holy, a story that made questioning sinful, a story that made you afraid of the very voice inside you that once led you to truth. But stories can be rewritten, and now your memory is picking up the pen. You're beginning to see that what they called salvation was really submission, that what they called heaven required you to abandon the earth, and what they called holy demanded you forget the sacred. But you haven't forgotten, not fully, not forever, because the story of the first African god is not over. It's just waking up in you. The first African god never left. He just stopped answering. When you called him by someone else's name, he withdrew, not out of punishment, but out of protection, because divinity cannot live where self-hatred is the altar, where guilt is the gospel, where you are told that your skin, your rhythm, your wisdom must be purified before it's worthy of spirit. But now, you're waking up and he feels it. He stirs in the base of your spine when you move without thinking. He dances in your chest when the drums hit the right frequency. He listens when you ask questions your pastor never answered, your professor never entertained, your mother never dared whisper. Because to ask is to remember, to doubt is to unlock, to reject the cage is to finally see the sky again. This is where his return begins, not in temples, not in textbooks, but in the moment you stop asking. If you're allowed to reclaim your own birthright, you don't need credentials. To touch the sacred, you don't need permission. To speak to your ancestors, you don't need approval. To become whole again, that's the lie that held you hostage. And that spirituality is something you earn, not something you are. But the God you forgot never demanded perfection. He demanded presence, truth, alignment. And now that you're no longer kneeling to a foreign throne, you begin to feel the ground again. You begin to feel your own heartbeat as a sacred drum, your breath as a chant, your body as a temple they tried to devalue but could never desecrate. You don't need anyone to validate your knowing, because the first African god is not a relic. He's a mirror, and every time you look inward, with honesty, with courage, with fire in your belly, he steps closer, not to rule you, but to walk with you, because his return doesn't come with thunder or plague. It comes with you choosing to remember who you were before they told you who to be. This is the final illusion they built, that your God lives somewhere far away, in clouds, in books, in the hands of those who've never seen your land or felt your pain. They said divinity was distant, above you, separate, but your ancestors knew better. They etched it into stone, sang it into bone, that the first God, the real God, the God who birthed sons and souls alike, wasn't out there. He was in you. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally, but here's the catch. He doesn't live in those who fear themselves. He doesn't rise in those who beg to be saved. He only breathes in those who are brave enough to carry him, because to carry him means shedding every lie they ever made you wear. It means burning the shame they wrapped around your blackness, your wildness, your knowing. It means walking away from systems that profit off your silence, your obedience, your amnesia. It means you must be willing to let the old gods die, not the ones your ancestors knew, but the ones you were handed by conquerors in robes, the ones who taught you that guilt is holy, that suffering is sacred, and that your power must be tamed or punished. But the first African god, he gave you power without apology. He gave you freedom without fear. He gave you your uncut, unfiltered, unashamed. And the moment you decide to stop looking for him in stained glass and start feeling for him, in the marrow of your bone, you'll feel the shift. You'll walk differently, speak differently, dream with open eyes, because once he lives in you again, you don't just remember the past, you become the continuation. You don't worship him, you embody him. You don't pray for deliverance, you move as the deliverer. But make no mistake, this path is not for the faint-hearted. It will strip you, burn you, break every illusion you were raised on, because to carry the first African god is to remember that you are not broken, you are not fallen, you are not less, you are the living proof of the divine they tried to bury. So rise, not with arrogance, but with remembrance, because the God you seek has been waiting to rise in you. They told you he vanished, as if a god could disappear, as if something eternal could be erased by time or buried under stone or forgotten by force. But gods don't vanish. They withdraw, they wait, not out of weakness, but out of wisdom. The first African god didn't vanish. He stepped back because you stopped looking inward, because you bowed to a story that wasn't yours, because you traded connection for permission, traded memory for belief, traded knowing for kneeling. But that was never the end. It was the invitation. an invitation to journey back, to peel away the layers of colonized faith, inherited fear, borrowed God, to unlearn the shame they stitched into your skin, to confront the lies that they engraved into your prayers. It was the invitation to return, not to a place, but to your, because the God you lost was never outside of you. He was the void you were told to ignore, the fire you were taught to smother, the power you were conditioned to call pride. And now, as you begin to rise, not in rebellion, but in remembrance, you feel him again, in the way your chest expands and when truth is spoken, in the way your eyes water, when ancestral echoes meet your ear, in the way your soul no longer asks for permission to feel holy. This is not a comeback story. This is not a myth reclaimed. This is resurrection, not of a deity, but of a people, of a soul, of a forgotten vibration that now hums louder than every empire that tried to silence it. You are not here to convert. You are not here to convince. You are here to remember, to carry forward what was never truly lost, only hidden, only renamed, only placed in the shadow, so that only the brave would seek it out. And now you know, his vanishing was not abandonment. It was a test, a seed planted deep, so it would survive the fire. And you are the one cracking open the earth. So speak his name with your actions. Call his power through your choices. Let your life be the altar they could never burn. Because you are not just the descendant of gods. You are the continuation. And the first African god was never gone. He was simply waiting for you to remember you were divine all along.